Lucius Annaeus Seneca was 19, perhaps 20, seated on a stone bench in a school in Rome, where the Stoic teacher Attalus spoke about fire. Not the fire of the hearth or the forge, but the fire the Stoics believed moved through all things, the logos, the rational principle that holds the world together and will one day consume it and begin it again. Attalus spoke quietly, the way teachers speak when they are genuinely certain of what they are saying, and the young man on the bench listened with his whole face. The losses had not arrived yet. The exile, the illness, the friends who would die before him, the years on a gray island, watching the sea, none of it had come. There was only the room, the voice of the teacher, and the image of a fire that the mind could contemplate without being destroyed by it. That room is worth holding for a moment. The school of Attalus was not grand. Stone walls, the particular quality of Roman morning light falling through a narrow opening, the smell of the city just outside and already audible, the clatter of carts being cleared from the streets before the pedestrian hours began. Seneca would later write that he left every session of Attalus's teaching as a better man than he arrived, and that this feeling persisted into the street, into the evening, into sleep. The philosophy was working on him before the world had given it anything difficult to work on. He was being shaped by ideas whose weight he could not yet measure, because the things that would test them had not yet arrived. The ideas arrived first, the losses followed, and the relationship between them, the way a philosophy absorbed in youth meets the grief of middle age and old age, is the quiet subject of nearly everything Seneca wrote across a lifetime of writing. He was born in the town of Corduba in the Roman province of Hispania Baetica, sometime around the turn of the first millennium, the second of three sons of a wealthy and intellectually formidable father. The elder Seneca, Marcus Annaeus Seneca, known as Seneca the rhetorician, was a man whose life's work was the collection and preservation of the great voices of Roman oratory, their arguments, their methods, their characteristic turns of phrase. He wrote for his sons, the manuscripts were addressed to them by name. The gift the father gave his children was not property or political connection, though there was some of that as well. The gift was a way of moving through language, a set of standards, an inherited seriousness about what words are for and what they owe to the people who hear them. When the elder Seneca died, Lucius was still relatively young, still forming. He would have sat with the manuscripts, unrolling them on a table in the way Roman scholars handled their scrolls, reading the sentences his father had written with the specific awareness that the man who wrote them was no longer present to explain them or expand on them or correct the young reader's misunderstandings. This is a particular quality of loss. The dead continue to speak in their letters and their books and the records of their arguments, but they have become fixed. They cannot be questioned further. What remains of them is complete in a way that living people never are, which is both less and, in some ways that take years to understand, more. The young Lucius, reading his father's careful prose, was encountering for the first time the strange stability of a voice that will not change again. He had come to Rome from Corduba as a child, brought to the city by an aunt who recognized his gifts and sought the best available education for him. This aunt appears only briefly in the surviving record, but she appears with warmth. Seneca would later write about her with something that has the quality of gratitude felt over a long time, the gratitude that recognizes, from a distance, how much of what one became was shaped by a particular person's specific care. She navigated Roman social hierarchies on his behalf. She introduced him to teachers. She was, in the quiet way that certain people are, a maker of conditions. In those early years, Seneca was drawn, with a young man's intensity to philosophy, not only to the Stoics. He spent time with the teachings of the Pythagoreans, with their dietary abstentions and their beliefs about the soul's transmigration. He followed the teaching of Sotion of Alexandria, who was Pythagorean in his orientation, and who persuaded the young Seneca to give up eating meat for a time, until the elder Seneca, concerned about the political associations of foreign philosophical practices in the reign of Tiberius, asked him to stop. The son complied, but the habit of philosophical experiment remained. He was a man who tried ideas by living them, not merely by reading them, and this would prove the most important thing about him. The great teacher of his young adulthood was Attalus. The sessions Seneca describes in his later letters are vivid in a way that only genuine memory produces, not reconstructed, not embellished for philosophical illustration, but specific. He writes of arriving early to claim the best position. He writes of following Attalus into the street after the lesson ended, pressing for more. He writes that Attalus spoke about the poverty of the philosophically serious life, as though poverty were a form of wealth, and that afterward Seneca walked home, wanting to give things away. The fire that Attalus described as the rational principle of the cosmos was also, in those years, something that burned in the listener. The ideas were not calm yet. They were bright and slightly urgent, the way everything is when it is first genuinely understood. Calm came later. It came the way most hard-won calm comes, through the testing of what one believed against what actually happened. The illness arrived early and stayed. Seneca suffered from what he describes, across many letters, as a condition of the chest, breathlessness arriving in the night, a labored quality to his breathing that became over the decades a companion he did not choose. Modern readers have speculated about tuberculosis, or a chronic asthma of the kind that would not be named for many centuries. The diagnosis does not matter much. What matters is the phenomenology of it, which Seneca described with the precision of a man who had spent years paying close attention to his own body's misbehavior. In the night, the breath would not come. The chest would tighten. The gap between breathing in and breathing out would seem for a moment to widen into something final. He described this in one of his letters as melete thanatu, practice for dying, not metaphorically, physiologically. Each attack instructed him in what the end of breathing feels like, so that the philosophical exercise of contemplating death was not, for Seneca, an abstract discipline, but something he had already done in his body, repeatedly, without choosing to. This is worth pausing on. There is a difference between a philosophy that tells one to practice thinking about death, and a philosophy practiced by a man who has already, on many occasions, believed he was dying. The ideas absorbed in Attalus's school about impermanence, about the body as something given on loan, about the difference between what belongs to us and what has merely been placed in our hands for a time. These ideas were not decorative. They were functional. They had to do real work against real fear. In the dark, in a body that was rehearsing over and over the experience they were meant to address. The respirations that settled again before dawn were not only a reprieve, they were, for a man with Seneca's philosophical formation, a form of evidence. He had been close enough to the edge to look over it, and the arguments about what lay there had not failed him. This is how a philosophy earns its keep, not by being elegant or by being admired, but by being present when the thing it prepares one for actually arrives. He married, apparently happily, a woman named Pompeia Paulina. He entered political life, becoming a successful advocate and eventually reaching the office of quaestor. He moved in the circles of the Roman elite with the particular ease of someone who has the social gifts but has never fully surrendered to what those gifts are in service of. He was popular, admired, wealthy in the way that Roman success under the Julio-Claudian emperors made men wealthy. He was also, quietly, a philosopher. These two things were not in conflict, or not yet. The conflict arrived with Caligula first, in a form that was humiliating rather than lethal. Seneca spoke too well in the Senate, and Caligula, who had the paranoid sensitivity to perceived competition that the historical record documents at length, prepared to have him killed. A woman in Caligula's circle, the account survives in a single source, and its details cannot be fully verified, reportedly argued that Seneca was already so ill that the effort of killing him was unnecessary. His lungs would do the work themselves. Caligula accepted this judgment, and Seneca survived by virtue of his own failing body, which had already saved his life in a different sense by teaching him how to endure the approach of death philosophically. Caligula died. Claudius succeeded him. Seneca's position in Rome improved briefly, then broke entirely. The circumstances of the exile are not entirely certain. What is known is that in 41 CE, in the early reign of Claudius, Seneca was charged with adultery with Julia Livilla, a niece of the emperor, and convicted. The charge may have been fabricated. Such charges were useful instruments of political removal in that period, and the surviving sources are not disinterested. What is certain is the outcome. Seneca was stripped of his property, his status was diminished, and he was sent to the island of Corsica, where he would remain for nearly 8 years. Corsica was not comfortable. The island sat in the Tyrrhenian Sea, rugged and largely hostile to the kind of life Seneca had known in Rome. The landscape was limestone and scrubland, the winters cold by Mediterranean standards, the community of exiles, not exactly the intellectual company of the capital. He had books, or managed to obtain them. He had the practice of writing, which he maintained with remarkable consistency. He had the philosophical formation of 2 decades, which was in the event the thing that mattered most. In that first winter, in whatever shelter the island afforded him, Seneca wrote a consolatory letter to his mother, Helvia, on the subject of her grief over his exile. The letter is addressed to her suffering. It spends its considerable length arguing that she should not grieve for him, because exile, properly understood by a Stoic mind, is not a genuine evil. It is a change of place, nothing more, and the soul carries its goods within itself, regardless of geography. He argues this case with intelligence and care. He makes the case well. But there is something else in the letter that the argument does not quite contain, the quality of a man applying consolatory reasoning to his own situation through the medium of applying it to someone else's. He is writing toward her, but also necessarily toward himself. The arguments about why exile is not a genuine evil are also arguments Seneca needs to believe. The letter is both a gift and a practice. This is one of the things grief does, or what the attempt to address grief philosophically does. It turns the consoler into a student of their own consolation. When one writes to another person about how to bear a loss, one discovers, in the act of writing, the exact places where the philosophy holds, and the places where it does not. The first winter in Corsica was, among other things, a long examination of which arguments survived the test of actually needing them. The shore of the island, in that season, the rough limestone visible at the waterline, the waves gray rather than blue, the lamp burning in whatever small space he occupied, is an image that lives in the gap between what the letters say and what the body of a man in forced exile must have felt. The letters argue for equanimity. They argue well. They do not, in their surviving form, record the nights when the equanimity was hard to reach. But Seneca later would be honest enough to acknowledge that the philosopher who claims complete freedom from distress is not reporting an experience but performing one. He knew that the arguments and the feelings were different things, and that the work of philosophy was to bring them gradually and imperfectly and with considerable effort into a closer relationship. He was not idle in Corsica. He wrote the Consolatio at Helvia. He also wrote the Consolatio at Polybium, addressed to a freedman of Claudius, flattering the emperor lavishly, transparently designed to secure the writer's recall from exile. The letter is philosophically compromised. Seneca knew it was compromised. He would not have argued, had anyone pressed him, that it represented his philosophy at its most consistent. But a man in exile for 8 years, separated from his home and his work, in the city where his intellectual life had meaning, is also a man under pressure, and Seneca was honest enough, in other letters written much later, to acknowledge that Stoic principles are easier to maintain when the circumstances pressing against them are less severe. The Corsican letters are evidence, among other things, of the distance between knowing what the philosophy requires and being able to sustain it continuously against the weight of what one's life has actually become. The recall came in 49 CE, arranged by Agrippina the Younger, who brought Seneca back to Rome to serve as tutor to her son Nero. He returned to a city that was both familiar and changed, and to a role that carried great influence and considerable risk. He was wealthy again, more so than before. He was at the center of Roman political life. He was also, in a way that the philosophical record reflects clearly, a man who had been instructed by his own experience in the unreliability of all such circumstances. In Rome he had friends, and the losses among them were not long in arriving. Aeneas Serenus, the name deserves to be held quietly for a moment. He was a friend of Seneca's, younger probably, and close enough that Seneca dedicated to him 3 of his philosophical works, De Constantia Sapientis, De Tranquillitate Animi, and De Otio, 3 texts. The intellectual intimacy implied by that dedication is significant. Serenus appears in De Tranquillitate Animi as the person posing the opening question. He is the one who describes his own state of mind to Seneca, who asks the philosopher for help with a kind of low, persistent unease. Not grief exactly, not anxiety exactly, but the feeling of a life not fully settled. Seneca addresses him with the warmth of someone who knows the questioner well enough to recognize the quality of what is being asked. Serenus died suddenly. Pliny the Elder records that he was killed by eating poisonous mushrooms at a dinner, a death absurd in its randomness, disproportionate in its finality, the kind of death that arrives without warning and without the preparation that a chronic illness, like Seneca's own, would have provided. Scholars who have read the letters Seneca composed in the years following have noticed in Epistle 63, addressed to Lucilius, nominally about another man's grief, structured as a philosophical treatment of how to mourn, something that reads differently if the reader knows what Seneca had recently lost. The arguments about preserving the dead in memory, about continuing to find pleasure in the recollection of a friend rather than being destroyed by the absence. These arguments have the texture of arguments that have been tested recently. The philosophy is not ornamental. It is being applied to something specific and still unhealed. Seneca received the news of Serenus's death, and whatever he did in the first moments of receiving it, whatever the stillness was like before grief fully announced itself, before the mind has quite processed the information, the ears have delivered. That stillness is the condition in which the philosophical discipline he had spent decades building was asked to do its actual work. He was in his late 50s or early 60s by this point. The years under Nero had brought wealth, but also increasing anxiety. The Principate of Nero moved, decade by decade, in a direction that anyone paying close attention could recognize as dangerous. Seneca withdrew gradually from active involvement in the court. He retired to his estates. He wrote, "The writing in these later years has a different quality than the earlier work, more personal, more willing to acknowledge the distance between the argument and the feeling, more honest about the philosopher as a person who is not outside the difficulty he is examining, but inside it. The deaths within his philosophical and social circle accumulated. Thrasea Paetus, a senator of Stoic conviction, a man who had expressed his opposition to Nero's worst excesses through the philosophical discipline of ostentatious withdrawal rather than open opposition, was condemned and executed. Rebellious Plautus, connected to Seneca's circle by philosophical and social bonds, was killed on Nero's order. These were men who had tried to live the philosophical life under conditions that made it dangerous, and their deaths demonstrated something that Seneca could not have failed to understand: the practice of Stoic philosophy, the refusal to participate in moral self-compromise simply because the emperor demanded it, could cost a man his life. The philosophy was not only a tool for managing the private facts of loss and illness, it was a position in the world, and positions in the world in Nero's Rome carried consequences. Seneca himself was forced into early retirement in around 62 CE, a withdrawal that was part strategic self-protection and part philosophical choice. The Epistulae Moralis, the letters to Lucilius, belong to this final period. They were composed in the last few years of Seneca's life, between roughly 62 and 65 CE, during the years when it would have been clear to a man of Seneca's experience and intelligence that the political situation around him was approaching some form of resolution, and that resolution was unlikely to leave him untouched. The Passonian conspiracy, the plot to assassinate Nero, was discovered in 65 CE. Seneca was implicated, though the depth of his actual involvement is uncertain. Nero sent a messenger with an order. Seneca was to take his own life. But in the years before that moment, in the period when the letters to Lucilius were being written, there is a quality to the writing that rewards attention. The letters are addressed to a friend, a younger man, in the form of personal philosophical correspondence. They cover an enormous range of subjects: time, friendship, death, the nature of the good, how to read, how to travel, how to manage fear, how to age well. They are among the most humane documents that ancient philosophy produced. And they were written by a man who, on some level of awareness that the writing itself reflects, knew he was writing toward an end, not performing the end, not announcing it, simply writing with the particular quality of attention that comes when a person understands that their time is not unlimited, and that the work they are doing with words is among the last and most important work they will do. The letters have the quality of something being completed, not rushed, not anxious, but attended to with the care a person brings to something they understand will outlast them. This is the posture from which Seneca's philosophy of grief must finally be understood, not as the theory of a man who had kept himself philosophically above suffering, who had observed loss from a safe intellectual distance and formulated arguments about it with the detachment of a physician who has never been ill, but as the settled practice of a man who had been exiled, who had spent 8 years on a rough island arguing himself into equanimity and not always succeeding, who had struggled to breathe in the night and used the struggle as philosophical instruction, who had lost a close friend to the random cruelty of a bad mushroom at a dinner party, who had watched colleagues and friends condemned for the crime of living as their philosophy required, who had spent years in proximity to an increasingly dangerous emperor and had been trying, throughout all of it, to remain the person the philosophy described. The distance between Attalus' classroom and Seneca's final years is enormous, and it is also a single continuous thing. The young man on the stone bench, listening to a teacher describe a fire that runs through all things, and the older man at a writing table composing careful letters to a friend in the full awareness that the letters might be the last work his hands would do. These are the same person. The philosophy that connected them was not unchanged across those decades. It had been tested and had broken in places and had been repaired and had been tested again and had held and had broken differently the next time and had been repaired differently. It was not a theory that had been proven. It was a practice that had been lived, imperfectly and continuously, through everything that a life under the Julio-Claudian emperors, in a body with failing lungs, could put in its way. What remained at the end of that practice was not certainty. The letters to Lucilius do not read as the work of a man who has resolved the difficulties he is writing about. They read as the work of a man who has found, through long engagement with those difficulties, that they can be inhabited without destroying him. The grief for Serenus, acknowledged but not abandoned. The fear of his own death met with the arguments he had been rehearsing for 40 years, and with whatever the rehearsal had managed to build in him against the day of the actual event. The losses of friends to political violence held inside a framework that insisted those losses were not the worst thing, that the worst thing would be to abandon the philosophy for the sake of safety and live a long life that was not, in the sense the philosophy intended, genuinely a life. He sat at the table. The lamp gave its particular quality of light. The stylus moved across the wax, or the pen across papyrus, in the manner that his hand had been moving for 6 decades of writing. Outside, the Roman night was quiet, or not quiet. The sounds of the city, the occasional call of a bird, the indifferent processes of a world that would continue past this moment, past this lamp, past this hand. The letters to Lucilius accumulated, each one a day's philosophical work, and each one a piece of something that Seneca, unlike Serenus, had time enough to complete, not because time was generous, but because the practice of living philosophically does not require an abundance of time. It requires only the willingness, on the particular day one has, to set down honestly what has been found, and what has been lost, and what endures between the two. The examined life, the Stoics understood, is not a life that avoids difficulty. It is a life that meets difficulty with the full weight of what careful and patient thinking has built in a person over many years. Seneca had been building for a long time. The losses had been present throughout the building, as material, as instruction, as the specific form of difficulty that Stoic philosophy had always been designed to address. He wrote toward Lucilius with the steadiness of a man who is not pretending the losses have not been losses. They have been, they remain, and the writing continues, the lamp burns, and the philosophical note that sounds in those final letters is the note of a practice that is still, in the last hours available to it, holding. Chrysippus was standing before a small group of students in Athens in the 3rd century before the Common Era, in a room where the afternoon light arrived at a low angle through a single opening in the stone wall. The bench was hard. The light was the color of old honey. He was speaking about the mind's errors, not with contempt for the minds that made them, but with the careful patience of someone who had looked closely at a mechanism and understood how it failed. The students who gathered to hear him were not seeking comfort. They were seeking precision. And the distinction Chrysippus was drawing that afternoon between the feeling that moves through the body when something beloved is lost and the judgment of the mind that takes hold of that feeling and transforms it into sustained suffering was among the most careful and most demanding distinctions his school had yet attempted. The feeling was not the problem. This was the first thing to understand, and it required some sitting with. The Stoics were not indifferent to loss. They were not asking anyone to turn away from what hurt, or to pretend that the sudden absence of a person who had occupied the center of a life left no vacancy behind it. Chrysippus had been a careful enough observer of human experience to know that the body responds to loss before the mind has formed any thought at all, that the chest closes, the breathing changes, that something in the organism recognizes the shape of what is gone before language arrives to name it. This was not error. This was the body being a body. What Chrysippus was tracking was something else. What he had noticed, and what he wanted his students to notice, was that grief rarely stops at the body's first response. Something continues it, something sustains it, and deepens it, and gives it a philosophical structure, even when the structure is invisible to the person grieving. The grief that goes on for months, the grief that furnishes every room of a life and refuses to leave, the grief that becomes the central fact of a person's days. This was not the body's first movement. This was something the mind was doing. And if the mind was doing it, then the mind could, in time and with sufficient care, do otherwise. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture the students had come to associate with a distinction arriving between the pull of grief in the body and the judgment of the mind that sustains it. He was saying, there is a gap, small perhaps, at first almost invisible, but it is there, and it is in that gap that philosophy has its work to do. The word Chrysippus used for what the mind was doing was crisis, judgment, assessment, a conclusion the mind draws about the nature of what has happened. When someone dies, the mind does not merely register an absence, it interprets the absence. It reaches a conclusion about what the absence means, about what has been lost, about whether the world has become a worse place in a fundamental and irremediable way. The grief that endures is built on this conclusion, and the conclusion, Chrysippus was arguing, contained an error, a specific, identifiable, correctable error about the nature of value. The error was this, that the beloved person who has died was the bearer of something genuinely good, something that touched the quality of the griever's soul, something whose loss makes the griever's life not merely different, but genuinely and permanently impoverished in a way that cannot be recovered. The error was the belief that genuine goods can be found outside the self and then taken away. Setting this argument down as a sentence makes it sound cold. It requires warmth to hold properly, and that warmth comes from understanding what the Stoics meant by a good. For Chrysippus and the school that followed him, there was a precise and demanding meaning to the word. A genuine good was something that made the soul better, not more comfortable, not more pleased, not better provided for, but actually better in its capacity for virtue, for reason, for right judgment. On this account, only virtue itself was genuinely good, and virtue, by definition, was something that lived in the soul and could not be removed from it by anything outside the soul's own choosing. Everything else, health, the presence of loved ones, comfort, reputation, the particular warmth of a friendship that had developed over years, all of this fell into a different category. The Stoics called things in this category adiaphora, a word that means something closer to indifferent than to unimportant. Preferred indifference, health over illness, friendship over isolation, the living presence of someone beloved over their absence, were genuinely preferable. Losing them was a real loss. The Stoics were not asking anyone to pretend otherwise. But it was not the loss of something that touched the soul's fundamental character, and grief built on the belief that had made a mistake about what kind of thing had been lost. The stone bench in the schoolroom, the low afternoon light, Chrysippus with his hand in the air, holding the distinction open. None of the students looked entirely comfortable. The argument was asking something difficult of them, not just intellectually, but personally, because most of them had lost something. Most of them knew the specific texture of the grief Chrysippus was describing, and the distinction he was drawing between the genuine loss of a preferred good and the false belief that a genuine evil had occurred required them to hold two things simultaneously. Yes, this hurts, and no, it is not the kind of hurt that has damaged what matters most. This is the architecture that the Stoics built for grief, and it is worth inhabiting slowly rather than evaluating quickly. The structure has 3 rooms, if it can be called that. The first room is the honest acknowledgement that something valuable has been lost. The Stoics never asked grief to begin anywhere else. The absence of a beloved person is a real absence, and the life that contained that person is genuinely different now from the life it was before. This is not minimized. The first room is as large and as dark as the loss requires it to be. The second room is the question of what kind of loss it is. Not a rhetorical question, not a way of diminishing the first room, but an honest philosophical inquiry into what exactly has been taken. Has virtue been taken? Has the capacity for reason, for honest living, for the examined life been taken? Has anything been removed from the soul's own fundamental character? The Stoics were asking the griever to look carefully at what was absent and to distinguish between the person missed, whose presence was a preferred good, whose warmth enriched the life around it, and the idea that the soul's own goodness has been somehow diminished by that person's death. The third room is the quietest. It is the room where the grief settles, where it is neither expelled nor enlarged, where it takes its proper size. Not small. The Stoics were not asking grief to be small, but proper. A grief that has understood what kind of thing was lost and has not added to that loss the additional weight of a false conclusion about the soul's now permanent diminishment. A grief that honors what was genuinely there and does not extend itself into a claim that cannot be sustained. The Stoics had a word for the kind of emotional response that inhabited this third room. The word was eupatheia, sometimes translated as good feeling or healthy passion, but meaning something more precise than either of those phrases suggests. A eupatheic response to loss was not the absence of response. It was not composure in the sense of having nothing to feel. It was a response that had been rationally examined and found to correspond to the actual nature of the situation, a genuine, honest acknowledgement of what was real, free of the false amplifications that suffering tends to add to itself. For grief, the eupatheic response was something close to what might be called rational sorrow, the acknowledgement that something genuinely preferable has been lost, the honest recognition that the life enriched is now different, the willingness to sit with that difference without either suppressing it or building a permanent structure around it. Rational sorrow did not deny that loss hurts. It denied only that the hurt was evidence of a permanent harm to what mattered most. Chrysippus was not a gentle man by most accounts. He was precise, argumentative, and sometimes difficult in exactly the way that people who think very carefully about things tend to be difficult. But the framework he built for grief was in its own demanding way a form of care. It was built by someone who had looked at suffering honestly and had refused both of the easy exits, the exit of pretending grief did not exist, and the exit of treating it as unquestionable, as something that had to be honored in whatever form it took, simply because it hurt. The framework asked more than either of those exits did. It asked the griever to think. Further along in that tradition, in a different city, in a different century, a man who had been born into slavery was teaching a similar distinction to students who came to him in Nicopolis, on the western coast of what is now Greece. Epictetus had a lame leg, the permanent result of a master's deliberate cruelty, a cruelty he had reportedly watched with complete calm, telling his master only that the leg would break if the pressure continued. When it broke, he is said to have observed that he had said it would. This story may or may not be historically accurate. What it preserves is something true about the way Epictetus inhabited the philosophy he taught, not as a set of positions to be argued, but as a way of remaining in the world without being destroyed by it. In his school at Nicopolis, Epictetus returned again and again to the question of attachment, not because he thought attachment was wrong in some moralistic sense, but because he had looked carefully at the structure of human suffering and had found that almost all of it shared a common architecture, the belief that something outside the self, something that fortune governed, something that could be given and taken by circumstances beyond the self's choosing, was necessary for the self's goodness. The suffering that followed the loss of beloved things was real. Epictetus never doubted that. What he doubted was the conclusion grief drew about why it hurt so much. When he spoke about bereavement to his students, and he spoke about it often, returning to it with the patience of someone who knew it was among the hardest things the philosophy had to address, he would sometimes reach for an image. The beloved person in your life is like something on loan, not in the diminishing sense of something borrowed that was never quite yours, but in the more honest sense that all living things exist within time, and time is not a medium you govern. To love a person fully, while understanding that they are not yours to keep forever, is not a lesser form of love. It may be a more honest one. It is love that has understood its own nature and has not confused the beloved person with property, has not secretly believed that grief, when it comes, would be proof that something was taken that should have been permanent. The argument Epictetus made was not that grief was wrong. It was that grief built on the belief that the beloved person was yours to keep contained a quiet misunderstanding of what the relationship had been. The person was not taken. The person was returned to whatever source all living things return to, the larger order within which individual lives occur and end. The phrase has the risk of sounding cold in summary. In the room in Nicopolis, with the particular quality of attention Epictetus brought to everything he said, it was apparently not cold at all. His students returned to the school. They found what he taught livable. Something in the argument, when held carefully enough, felt less like a severance and more like an opening. To give back what was never permanently yours is different from having something taken. The first describes reality. The second adds a judgment, that a wrong has been done, that the universe has violated some arrangement it had made, and it is precisely this added judgment, Epictetus was saying, that accounts for the specific bitterness and grief that goes beyond the simple honest ache of absence. The ache of absence is real and does not require philosophical correction. The bitterness is built on a misreading of the original arrangement, and it can, with patience, be addressed. In his Enchiridion, the small handbook of Stoic practice that his student Arrian compiled from his spoken teachings, Epictetus put the point as plainly as it could be put. When you are kissing your child, or your brother, or your friend, he wrote, do not add to the feeling the thought that they will always be here. Only say, now I am kissing this person I love. When they are gone, do not say I have been robbed. Say I have returned what was lent. The practice of saying this was not a way of not grieving. It was a way of grieving without adding to the genuine loss the additional suffering of believing that a permanent wrong had been done to you by a universe that was never organized around your preferences. The Entorglund is a small document. It fits in a coat pocket. If coats had existed in the ancient world, its arguments are compressed, sometimes to the point of seeming stark, but Epictetus had seen enough human suffering, had inhabited it in enough different forms, the suffering of the enslaved, the suffering of the powerless, the suffering of those who had been physically broken and had to continue existing inside the bodies that had been broken, to know that the arguments in that small book were not theoretical. They were load-bearing. They held something up. The Stoic school that Chrysippus helped to systematize, and that Epictetus inhabited as practice had, by the time Marcus Aurelius came to it in the 2nd century of the Common Era, become something deeply private. Marcus was not a teacher. He was not trying to persuade anyone. He was, in the notebooks that came to be known as the Meditations, thinking out loud, or rather, thinking in writing, in the particular way that a person writes when they are working something through for themselves, rather than demonstrating it for others. Marcus had lost a great many people. He had lost children. He had lost the philosophical friends whose company had formed the texture of his inner life. He had lost Cornelius Fronto, the rhetorician who had taught him. He had lost Junius Rusticus, whose copy of Epictetus had changed the direction of his thinking. He was, for much of the period when he was writing the Meditations, on campaign on the Danube frontier, living in tents, managing enormous distances from everything he had valued most: the city, the conversation, the quiet hours of reading and writing that had organized his private existence. The losses were real, and they were many. What the Meditations record is not the philosophical position of someone who has resolved the problem of grief and moved past it. They record the philosophical practice of someone who is working the problem continuously, returning to it with a regularity that looks, across the full text, less like argument and more like prayer. He would write about dissolution, how every beloved thing returns to the elements, how the specific form of a person is a temporary arrangement of matter that will separate and recombine into other forms, how the grandeur and grief of this is made easier by understanding that the same process applies to everything, including the self that is doing the grieving. He would write it carefully, with full attention, with the particular quality of thought that the Stoic framework required, and then he would close the notebook and return to whatever the emperor was required to do that day. The Meditations were not published. Marcus did not intend them for an audience. This matters for understanding what they contain, because what they contain is not a completed philosophy of grief, tidied and arranged for presentation. What they contain is the evidence of someone using the Stoic framework as it was actually designed to be used, as a daily tool applied to the ongoing reality of a life that kept producing occasions for its application. One passage returns several times in different forms. The note of it is consistent, that all things beloved dissolve, that the dissolution is not a wrong done to the lover, but the simple completion of a natural process, that the proper response to this knowledge is not grief's bitterness, but something more like sober gratitude for whatever duration was given. The word gratitude does not appear in Marcus's Greek, but what he was reaching for was close to it, the acknowledgement that the arrangement, while it lasted, was genuinely good, and that its ending does not retroactively empty what came before it. He was writing this on a campaign in which men were dying around him regularly. He was writing this as an emperor responsible for the deaths of enemies and the protection of subjects, both at the same time, in ratios he could not always control. He was writing this as a man who had sent letters home to Rome for years and had returned to a city that was different from the one he had left each time. The passages about dissolution in the Meditations are not detached. They are the opposite of detached. They are the record of a mind that had found, in the Stoic framework, not a way to stop feeling loss, but a way to hold it without being destroyed by it. The architecture Chrysippus had sketched in Athens centuries before was still standing. Marcus was living in it. The framework rests on a distinction that can be stated simply and that requires a long time to actually inhabit, the distinction between what is genuinely valuable and what is genuinely preferred. The Stoics wanted grief to stop where the false belief stopped, at the point where honest sorrow about the loss of something genuinely preferred was inflated by the false additional claim that a permanent evil had occurred, that the soul had been diminished, that the fundamental goodness of a life had been permanently compromised by something that fortune had arranged. This is not a small or easy distinction. Anyone who has lost someone central to their life knows that the body does not observe it naturally. The body experiences the loss as precisely the kind of fundamental blow the Stoics were saying it was not. And the Stoics, at least the careful ones, the ones who had actually lost people and had not merely theorized about loss, knew this. The distinction is not experienced all at once. It is approached and partially felt and partially not felt, and returned to over many seasons. There is an image that the Stoic framework itself suggests, though no single ancient text places it exactly this way. It is the image of a house with several rooms, not a house designed to lock grief out. The Stoics were not arguing for lockout. The house is designed to give grief a place to sit that is neither the floor nor the throne, neither denied nor given the full governance of the building. Grief in this house has a room. The room has a window. What comes through the window is whatever the nature of the loss actually was. The genuine preferences that have been removed. The genuine warmth that is absent now. The room is appropriate to that. The house does not ask the grief to be smaller than it is. What the house does not permit is for grief to expand into every room at once, to take over the building, to install itself in the place where the soul's own capacity for virtue and right judgment lives. That capacity is in a different room, and the Stoic framework was designed to keep the door to that room from being confused with the door to the grief room. The confusion is the error, the correction is the architecture. Chrysippus had gestured toward this distinction with his hand in the low afternoon light. Epictetus had inhabited it from the position of someone who had very little to lose in the material sense, and had therefore had to make the philosophical distinction very precisely. Marcus had written it into his notebooks on the Danube frontier, in a tent, by candlelight, because writing it was the closest he could come to believing it as a felt reality rather than merely accepting it as a true position. Between the acceptance of a true position and the felt reality of it, there is a considerable distance. The Stoics knew this. They had a name for the work that covered this distance, askesis, which meant practice, exercise, the repeated application of a philosophical discipline to the actual texture of a life. The framework was not designed to be understood once and then applied automatically. It was designed to be worked through repeatedly, returned to at every occasion the life provided, refined by the particular weight of specific losses against which the general arguments were tested. A student reading Chrysippus's definition of grief, the irrational contraction of the soul, might pause at the word contraction and recognize it before anything else. The tightening, the way the chest closes around a loss before the mind has caught up. The recognition would be immediate and physical, and this recognition, arriving before any argument, was itself a form of philosophical starting point, because if the contraction can be noticed, it can be observed. And if it can be observed, the observation creates, however briefly, the small gap between feeling and judgment that Chrysippus had been pointing at in that stone schoolroom with his hand held still in the late afternoon light. The gap is small. It does not resolve grief. It does not complete the argument. It is only the beginning of a very long work. But the Stoics would say that finding the gap, noticing the contraction, understanding what kind of movement it was, seeing the judgment embedded in it, was not a preliminary to the philosophical work. It was the philosophical work at its root, as it actually starts, in the body, in the breath that has changed, in the noticing that precedes everything else. The philosophy asks of someone who is trying to carry something difficult with as little unnecessary weight as possible. Marcus closed his notebook. The lamp in his tent had been burning for some time and was lower now than when he had begun. The campaign was not finished. The losses were not finished. The argument about dissolution was on the page, complete, in the careful Greek he had written it in, since the early years, when Rusticus had first handed him Epictetus's words, and something in him had recognized a way of thinking that he had been looking for, without knowing he was looking. The pages did not claim to have ended anything. They claimed only to have set the thing down carefully enough that it could be picked up again tomorrow, or next week, or in the long years of returning to a question that was not finished and could not be finished, but could be made by enough patient returning into something that sat in the life as a weight that had found its proper place. The notebook closed. The lamp held its small, steady flame. Outside the tent, the river continued in the dark, moving as it had moved before any of these arguments existed, and would continue to move long after the notebook and the arguments had become part of whatever large ongoing process returns everything eventually to what it came from. In the hour before the Roman household woke, Seneca sat at his writing table with a stylus in his hand and the surface of the wax tablet catching what light there was. The oil lamp had been burning since before dawn. The room was quiet in the particular way of rooms whose silence has been inhabited for some time, not empty, but settled, the way a mind settles after it has been working long enough that the work begins to do itself. He was composing a letter to Lucilius, as he did most mornings in these years, and the tablet received the words in the order they came, which was not always the order of argument, but sometimes the order of memory, of something half noticed, the day before that had continued its motion through the night. The stylus moved. The lamp held its flame without much trembling. Outside, somewhere in the distance, the city was beginning its noise, but not yet quite. Seneca wrote to Lucilius across years and distance. Lucilius was in Sicily, governing a province, reading philosophy in whatever hours his duties allowed, and the letters that passed between them were something the form of correspondence makes difficult to name cleanly. They were instructions, sometimes. They were arguments, often. They were the kind of thinking that happens most honestly when addressed to a specific person, whose face the writer can hold in mind, whose particular confusions and resistances and genuine seriousness the argument is shaped to reach. And occasionally, in the quieter letters, they were something closer to what a man says when he is working something out for himself by the act of writing it down for someone else. Epistle 63 is one of the quieter ones. Lucilius had lost a friend. Flaccus his name was, and the loss was recent enough that the grief still had its initial weight. the specific heaviness that belongs to the first days when the absence has not yet become familiar and keeps arriving as fresh news. Seneca wrote to him carefully. He began where a careful man begins, which is not with the argument, but with the acknowledgement that the loss is real and that grief for a friend who has died is not something to be ashamed of or rushed past. Some weeping, he wrote, is permitted the wise man, not the kind that dissolves everything, but the kind that passes through him and then settles, the kind that acknowledges what was actually lost. What follows in that letter is one of Seneca's most patient pieces of thinking. A friend who has died, he argues, is not simply absent. The relationship has changed its form. What was present and contingent, subject to fortune, to distance, to illness, to all the ordinary frailties that attach themselves to a living person, has become something that fortune can no longer reach. The dead friend, he says, exists now in the memory of the one who loved him, and in that location is more secure than the living ever are. Memory does not depend on health or proximity or the thousand small accidents that can interrupt a friendship while both people are alive. To remember a dead friend with care, to call up the particular way he argued, the things he characteristically noticed, the quality of his attention in a conversation, is to continue a relationship with something that cannot be taken away by the usual instruments of loss. It is a serious argument, and Seneca is serious in making it. The dead are preserved in memory in a form paradoxically more stable than the living could ever be. There is something else moving through that letter, just below the surface of every argument about Lucilius's grief. Serenus had died. Aeneas Serenus, the man to whom Seneca had dedicated 3 of his longest philosophical works, the friend whose name appears in those dedications with a warmth that the formal conventions of dedication do not fully account for. Serenus had eaten mushrooms at a dinner and had not recovered. Pliny records it as an event. The letter to Lucilius does not say his name, but the argument of the letter, its particular urgency about the preservation of the dead in memory, its insistence that the relationship continues rather than ends, reads differently when placed against that silence. The philosopher writing about how to carry a friend's death is in that letter also carrying one. He does not say so. He keeps the argument addressed to Lucilius, keeps it directed outward at another man's grief. This may be the most honest thing about the letter, or the most private, or both. Seneca composed the Consolatio ad Marcium in a different register from the letters, more formal, the address more public, the argument more systematically arranged. Marcium was a woman of considerable standing in Rome, the daughter of Aulus Cremucius Cordus, the historian whose work had been condemned and burned under Tiberius, and who had starved himself to death rather than face the charges against him. Marcia had preserved her father's work, had reissued his histories when the political climate shifted, had acted with a kind of quiet courage that the historical record preserves. She was not, in other words, a fragile person. She had already absorbed one loss that would have undone most people. Her son Metilius had died. He had died young. She had been mourning him for 3 years by the time Seneca wrote, and the grief by that point had become something that occupied every room she lived in, had arranged itself around her like furniture she could no longer see past. 3 years of unrelenting mourning, Seneca understood, is no longer simply grief. It has become something else, a way of inhabiting time, a structure that organizes the hours, a form of faithfulness to the dead that has slowly transformed into a form of faithfulness to the grief itself, which is a different thing. Seneca does not condemn her. The Consolatio ad Marcium does not begin by correcting Marcium. It begins by honoring her father's courage, by acknowledging what she had already endured and survived. by establishing that the person he is writing to has shown elsewhere in her life that she is capable of more than this grief currently permits. He is not, in the opening pages, making an argument. He is placing her in the room where her own better history is visible to her. The argument comes later, and it is not gentle, but it is not cruel either. Grief that has extended past its natural arc, Seneca tells her, is no longer grief for Metilius. It has become something oriented toward Marcia herself, toward her own need to continue the mourning, her own resistance to the process by which loss changes shape over time. The dead, he argues, do not require this. Metilius did not live and die in order to become the permanent occasion of his mother's suffering. To insist on maintaining the grief at its highest pitch, year after year, is not love, even if it presents itself as love. It is a confusion of love with its most acute and unproductive form. He offers her the figure of Octavia, Augustus's sister, as a kind of cautionary presence. Octavia had lost her son Marcellus, the young man whose death Virgil marks with some of the most moving lines in the Aeneid, and had refused every consolation. She would not allow his name to be spoken in her presence without dissolving. She dismissed from her household anyone who tried to read her anything from the works dedicated to his memory. She maintained her grief at its original temperature for decades. She lived, Seneca writes, as though she had vowed to herself that she would never emerge from the depths of her sorrow. And this, Seneca says plainly, did not honor Marcius. It simply produced in Octavia a kind of continuous death, a living person who had chosen to stop fully inhabiting her life. The distinction Seneca is drawing here is not between feeling grief and not feeling it. He is not asking Marcia to stop caring about her son, or to pretend the loss is smaller than it is, or to perform a recovery she has not undergone. He is asking her to notice whether the grief she is sustaining has anything left in it of Metilius himself, or whether it has become, over 3 years, primarily about her relationship to her own sorrow. Love, he argues, looks in a different direction than the one grief eventually turns toward when it goes on long enough without philosophical tending. Love looks at the person who died. Extended, unexamined grief looks inward at the griever. In the Roman house where Marcia read this letter, the argument would have arrived at a particular kind of angle. It is not comfortable, it is not designed to be. But Seneca believed that the only consolation that genuinely serves the bereaved is the kind that tells the truth, even when the truth is unwelcome, and that a text which simply reflects Marcia's grief back to her with sympathy would leave her exactly where she was. He thought philosophy owed people more than that. Epistle 77 circles a different problem, not the grief of the living for the dead, but the question of whether a short life can be a complete life, whether duration and value are actually connected in the way that most people assume without examining. Seneca was watching the grain ships arrive from Alexandria one afternoon at the harbor at Puteoli, the sails still set, the ships visible from a distance, with the distinctive rigging that allowed the Alexandrian ships to be identified before the harbor. There was something in the scene that turned his thinking toward the question of completion, the way the ships had sailed a full journey and arrived, the journey not diminished by being over. A life well lived, he argues in that letter, does not require duration to achieve its full value. This is not a comfortable position if one assumes that more life is always better, that virtue and wisdom and genuine achievement accumulate like interest over time. Seneca is pushing back at that assumption. Virtue, he says, is not a quantity that increases with the years it is practiced. A courageous act is fully courageous, whether the person who performed it lives 1 more day or 30 more years. A life in which a person has truly learned to live, has confronted what it means to exist, has cultivated honest relationships, has done genuine philosophical work, is complete at whatever moment it ends. The Alexandrian ship is not a lesser ship because its voyage was 3 weeks rather than 3 months. This argument has particular implications for grief. If the life of a person who died young is not incomplete, if it held in the time it had the full weight of a human life genuinely occupied, then the grief for that person is not grief for something unfinished. The grief is real, the loss is real, but the life itself was not a fragment. It was a whole. Seneca is not minimizing the grief Lucilius carries. He is adjusting the lens through which the thing lost is seen, because he believes the grief looks different, is different, when the life lost is understood as complete rather than interrupted. The Consolatio ad Polybium was written in a different circumstance from any of these other texts, and the difference is visible on every page. Seneca was in his Corsican exile during the reign of Claudius. He had been there for nearly 8 years, banished on a charge of adultery, whose political motivations were largely transparent. Polybius was a powerful freedman in Claudius's court, a secretary, an administrator, someone whose influence with the emperor was real enough that Seneca could calculate what addressing him might accomplish. Polybius had lost a brother. Seneca wrote him a consolation. The letter has some of the technical philosophical furniture that Seneca deploys elsewhere. Arguments about the natural arc of grief, about the inappropriateness of unlimited mourning, about the way a good man faces loss. But running through it, unmistakable, is something that sits at considerable distance from the philosophical positions Seneca advances in every other consolation text he wrote. The letter flatters Claudius with a degree of elaborateness that Seneca himself, writing from any position of greater freedom, would never have indulged. It praises the emperor's learning and wisdom in terms that Seneca understood to be false, terms that the private judgment of any honest man who had watched Claudius govern would have refused. The flattery is designed to secure his recall, and Seneca must have known while writing it that it did not work as consolation, that it served a different purpose entirely, one that had nothing to do with Polybius's grief and everything to do with Seneca's own. It is an uncomfortable document to sit with, because Seneca had written clearly elsewhere about exactly this kind of compromise. He understood the philosophical position on what a wise man may say to power, and on what philosophy costs when it agrees to flatter rather than instruct. The Consolatio ad Polybium is the place in his corpus where those arguments are most visibly under pressure, where the philosopher can be seen making a calculation that the philosophy, strictly speaking, would not permit. This is not hidden in the text, it is there. Scholars who have read it carefully have read it as a document that fails on its own philosophical terms, and the failure is instructive precisely because it is Seneca's failure, not a stranger's. The man who wrote to Marcia about the difference between genuine love and self-serving grief is in this letter performing a kind of philosophical self-service, using the consolation form to accomplish something that had very little to do with consoling anyone. Philosophy under pressure bends. Even in hands as practiced as his, it bends. The Consolatio ad Polybium records the bending with an honesty that is almost, in its own way, philosophical. The text doing what Seneca himself might have analyzed in another man's writing. Epistle 99 is almost the opposite in spirit. Marullus had lost a young son. The son was old enough to have been loved specifically, to have developed the particular character that makes a child irreplaceable, but young enough that the loss is the kind that feels most nakedly arbitrary, the most difficult to set inside any framework of meaning. Seneca wrote to him, and the letter is the most unsparing in the consolation texts. It is the one that most explicitly applies philosophical pressure to a raw wound, and Seneca is aware that this is what he is doing. He begins the letter by naming the hardness of what he is about to say. He will not offer Marillus the customary gentleness. He will not perform sympathy that the philosophical situation does not support. A true friend, he argues, does not agree with the griever in order to make the griever more comfortable in the short term. A true friend tells the griever what the grief actually is and what it is not, and what the grief for a young child held at the pitch Marillus is holding it actually is, as Seneca sees it, is a form of error, not the error of loving the child, which was right and good. The error of the judgment that the child's death constitutes a devastating evil, an injury done to Marillus, a wrong inflicted on the universe. The child, Seneca writes, has been returned to where all things come from. Nothing that must return can be called taken. This is one of the places where Seneca's philosophy is most demanding, and for many readers, most difficult. The argument has a logic, but logic applied at this proximity to genuine grief produces a kind of cold clarity that can feel more like hardness than like care. Seneca knew this. He says so in the letter. He defends the hardness explicitly, arguing that the alternative, a consolation designed to soothe rather than to clarify, leaves the griefer in the grip of the false belief that produced the grief rather than helping him examine it. He is betting that Marillus, as a man of philosophical inclination, would rather be told the truth than be comforted with something softer and less honest. Whether that bet was right is a question the letter does not resolve, and probably cannot. What it demonstrates clearly is the outer edge of Seneca's philosophical commitments, the point at which the conviction that right thinking produces right living runs directly against the grain of what the grieving actually feel and need. Seneca does not pull back from that edge. He stands on it, and he writes the letter that stands on it, and he sends it, and he trusts Marillus to receive it as the form of respect it was intended as, rather than the form of coldness it risks looking like. There is something notable in all of these letters and consolation texts taken together, something that only becomes visible when they are set against each other. Seneca is not the same philosopher in each of them. He is warmer in some than in others. He applies pressure at different intensities. He admits his own grief in the letter to Lucilius in a way he does not permit himself in the more formal consolation texts. In the Corsican letter, he abandons his principles for personal advantage and does not attempt to disguise the abandonment. In Epistle 99, he says things that he acknowledges will be unwelcome and says them anyway. What this inconsistency reveals is not a man whose philosophy is unreliable. It reveals a man doing philosophy under the conditions that actual human life imposes, conditions that include illness, exile, political terror, personal grief, and the ordinary weakness that attaches itself to even the most practiced thinker. The philosophy does not arrive already complete and inviolable. It is worked out repeatedly in the specific difficulty of specific situations, and it bends sometimes, and it holds sometimes, and the bending is as much a part of the record as the holding. This is one of the things that makes Seneca's consolation texts worth reading across 2,000 years of distance. They are not demonstrations of philosophical mastery. They are records of philosophical effort that is serious and honest, even when it is not entirely successful, effort that continues even when the circumstances are working against it, effort that shows what it actually looks like to try to live according to ideas one genuinely believes. Seneca believed that grief was not something to be suppressed or rushed past. He believed it was something to be examined, looked at carefully, understood in its structure, asked what false beliefs it was carrying, asked what genuine love it contained, asked whether it was oriented toward the person who died or toward the griever's own emotional needs. He believed that philosophy offered specific tools for this examination, and that offering those tools honestly was the most genuine form of care available. He also believed, and this is in the letter to Lucilius, in the admission that he himself wept for Serenus, in the acknowledgement that the framework and the feeling are separated by considerable distance, that knowing the right answer philosophically and arriving at it emotionally are two different achievements, and that the gap between them is closed slowly, with patience and without the expectation that argument alone will do the work. The tablet fills, the lamp continues. Outside, the Roman morning is well underway now, the streets with their noise, the household with its movement, the day asserting its ordinary claims. But for a little while longer the room holds its stillness, and the writing continues, and the words take their shape in wax before they will be made permanent, copied out, carried elsewhere to whoever needs them. In a Roman house somewhere, a woman named Marcia was in her 3rd year of mourning. The letter from Seneca had not yet arrived, or had just arrived, or was still being composed in the mind of a man who understood that the most honest consolation is not the most comforting one. The letter would argue that her grief had transformed, over 3 years, from love into something love would not have wanted. It would tell her that Metilius did not ask for this. It would tell her that she still had work to do, and that the work was the more faithful tribute to the life he had actually lived. The Consolatio ad Marcium ends quietly, not with triumph, not with the sound of grief resolved, but with the image of Metilius at rest, past the reach of fortune, past the fluctuations of political life and physical health, and all the difficulties that had accumulated around his mother's visible life. He is at rest, and Marcia is still here, still subject to time, still within reach of the work that philosophy asks of those who remain. On a table in a Roman interior, in the late hours of a night whose lamp has burned low without anyone moving to add more oil, the scroll of the Consolatio lies open at its final pages. The argument has made its way through grief, through the natural arc of mourning, through the long case against the grief that becomes self-consuming, through the careful placement of Metilius in the most stable location the philosophy can offer, the place where fortune can no longer reach him, the place where his mother's love for him is no longer endangered by the contingencies of a living person's life. The lamp flame leans a little in some invisible current of air and then straightens and holds. The final words of the letter rest on the open scroll in the steadying light. Marcia remains, the work remains, and the flame holds its small circle of warmth against the surrounding dark, neither advancing nor retreating, burning at the quiet pace of a thing that has found its own steadiness, and will hold it until the oil is gone. Seneca is reading by late afternoon light, a scroll partially unrolled across his lap, the papyrus stiff and slightly darkened at the edges from years of handling. He has come to a passage about Serenus. He does not read past it immediately. He sits with it the way one sits with something that has changed shape over time, but has not disappeared. The way a stone worn smooth by a river is still, unmistakably a stone. What he notices is not what he expected to notice. The grief is still there, but it has moved. It no longer occupies the foreground of every thought, pressing forward with the specific urgency of new loss. It has settled somewhere further back toward the wall, where it has become something more like a permanent feature of the room than an emergency inside it. The words he wrote about Serenus, still carry his friend's presence, the quickness of his mind, the particular way he held a question, as though it were something physical, weighing it in both hands before setting it down. What the words carry is not absence. It is something closer to presence at a remove, steadier, in certain ways than presence ever was. He sets the scroll down. The afternoon continues around him, unhurried. This was the discovery Seneca returned to across the long middle of his philosophical life, and it arrived not as theory, but as lived observation, the kind that cannot be forced, but only noticed when the right conditions have gathered. Time, on its own, does very little for grief. He had seen enough of mourning to know that duration alone changes almost nothing, that a grief entered in a spirit of absolute fidelity to suffering can persist for decades without diminishing, can furnish a life completely, can become the frame through which every subsequent experience is interpreted. Time does not heal, but philosophical practice, sustained across time, does something that has the same texture as healing, while being, at its roots, something more precise. It is not the softening of pain. It is the slow reorientation of the entire question, a gradual shift from what has been lost to what has been given, from the absence to the deposit, from the wound to the ground. The argument runs through de brevitate vitae with the particular patience of a man who has thought something all the way to its end. Most people, Seneca observed, live in the wrong direction. They spend their present moment on the future, on plans not yet realized, on conditions not yet achieved, on the life they intend to begin once certain things are settled. The past falls behind them as they go, and they do not look at it, do not reclaim it, do not understand it as theirs. What they lose by this forward lean is enormous, though it is difficult to name because the loss happens gradually and without a single moment of obvious deprivation. The future they spend their present on is never guaranteed. It arrives late or changed or not at all. But the past, once it has been lived with genuine attention and genuine care, the past cannot be revised. It cannot be taken. Fortune, which reaches its fingers into every planned tomorrow, has no grip on what has already been. He was not writing only about grief when he wrote this, but the implication for grief is direct. When someone beloved dies, the loss is forward-facing. It is the loss of a continuing future, of all the conversations that will not now occur, of the warmth and the friction and the ordinary texture of shared life that will not now continue. That forward-facing loss is real. It cannot be dismissed. But alongside it, and often overlooked in the urgency of mourning, lies something the loss cannot reach, every meal already shared, every disagreement already worked through to resolution or set down without resolution, but still completed, every moment of genuine recognition already exchanged between two people whose friendship was real. The past of the relationship is sealed. It is, in the only sense that matters, philosophically, permanent. What death interrupts is the future of the relationship. What death cannot touch is its history, and the history is where the friendship actually lives. Someone alone in a quiet room, a year or more after a death, calling deliberately to mind the particular way the person who died moved through the world, the specific cadence of their speech, the way they laughed at something unexpected, the arguments they made with patient certainty, the moments of uncertainty they allowed themselves only among those they trusted. That act of deliberate recollection is not, for Seneca, what grief looks like when it has nowhere left to go. It is what philosophical practice looks like when it is working correctly. He described it in Epistle 63 with notable specificity, not the passive drift into memory that grief sometimes produces uninvited, but the active, intentional cultivation of recollection as a discipline. The distinction matters. Passive drift can deepen sorrow, can arrive unbidden and cut with fresh precision, can feel like losing the person all over again in miniature. Deliberate recollection is something different. It is the philosopher choosing to return to what was good in a friendship with the specific aim of finding in it something solid and warm, rather than only the evidence of what is gone. The Stoic practice Seneca connects this to is prosophe, attention, the careful ongoing observation of the quality of one's inner life. Prosophe is ordinarily understood as a practice of self-monitoring, the philosopher watching their own responses and judgments as they arise, catching the moments when a false belief is beginning to harden into a settled attitude. But Seneca understood it as applicable to memory as well, to pay careful attention to what one carries from a relationship, to handle those memories with the same deliberateness one brings to present experience, to let the quality of a past friendship be genuinely felt, rather than either suppressed or dissolved into vague sentiment. This is a form of inner attentiveness that honors both the dead and the philosopher's own capacity for clear sight. The memories are not simply warm, they are true, and it is their truth, their specificity, their irreducibility to general consolation that makes them philosophically useful. There is a distinction Seneca drew consistently across his consolation writing, and it is worth holding carefully because it is easy to miss. He drew a line between grief that is genuinely oriented toward the person who has died, and grief that has, somewhere in its long unfolding, reoriented itself toward the griever. The first kind of grief is measured by love. It is proportional to the actual relationship, to what was genuinely shared, to the specific weight of this particular loss, and no other. The second kind uses the dead as a fixed point of reference for a continuing drama that is at its center about the grief itself, about the performance of faithfulness, about the way mourning has come to structure and justify a certain way of living in the world. Seneca did not make this distinction to accuse mourners of bad faith. He made it because he believed that the confusion between these two registers of grief is genuinely easy to fall into and genuinely harmful once it has taken hold. To remain in grief long past the point at which it serves the dead, past the point at which it honors what was real about the relationship, is not love extended, but love transformed into something that blocks rather than preserves what love was actually for. The figure of Octavia, Augustus's sister, was held in view as the limit case. For decades after the death of her son Marcellus, she had refused every consolation, every return to public life, every argument that the living had continuing obligations which the dead, if they could speak, would likely have endorsed. She wore grief as a garment. She made it her defining fact, and Seneca's reading of this, quiet and without condemnation in its phrasing, was that this was not Marcellus preserved, but Marcellus pressed into service as the anchor of his mother's self-conception. The son himself, in whatever way the philosophical imagination could speak of him, would not have recognized this as tribute. What people who loved genuinely want for those they leave behind is not permanent withdrawal. It is the continuation of a life that the lost person's own love helped to build and sustain. To refuse that continuation is to honor the grief more than the relationship the grief grew from. Against Octavia, Seneca placed not a cold argument, but an image of what love looks like when it has understood what Stoic thought requires of it. Grief does not end, it does not burn out, does not shrink to nothing, does not require a ceremony of closure. What changes under philosophical tending is its orientation. The question it asks shifts over time from what was taken to what was given. The energy it carries turns gradually from the wound toward the ground, from the place where something was removed to the place where something permanent was deposited and cannot now be touched. Premeditatio malorum is the practice most commonly misread as a kind of deliberate unhappiness, the philosopher sitting at a shared meal and thinking about how it will end, introducing the cold breath of future loss into the warmth of present joy. Seneca understood it differently. The point of anticipating loss is not to drain the present of its warmth, but to sharpen the attention that brings the warmth into focus. Most of what matters in a life is lost not to death, but to inattention, to the habitual drift into abstraction, to the assumption that this meal, this friendship, this evening light will be available again tomorrow and the tomorrow after, and so the present instance of it does not require the full weight of one's notice. Premeditatio malorum corrects that assumption not by installing grief in advance, but by making the present vivid with the acknowledged knowledge of its impermanence. The philosopher who pauses at a shared table and actually sees the person across from them, the specific, unrepeatable person in this specific light, at this point in both their lives, is not performing an exercise in sadness. They are practicing a form of love that has been made more precise by the clear-eyed acknowledgement that it will not last forever. What premeditatio malorum generates, when it is practiced steadily and without self-dramatization, is not anxiety, but gratitude. This is the deep connection that Seneca moved toward throughout his later letters to Lucilius, and it is the transformation at the center of his philosophy of grief. Gratitude here does not mean cheerful acceptance or the forced conversion of loss into some kind of philosophical win. It means the quiet, accurate recognition of what was real, the steady act of naming what was given before it was taken, and understanding that the giving was complete in itself, was not invalidated by the taking, was not retroactively diminished by the fact that it ended. A friendship that lasted 20 years and then ended in death was not a 20-year failure. It was 20 years of the specific thing it was, fully itself at every stage, permanently deposited in the past that loss cannot reach, available to deliberate recollection in the form it always had. The honest limit of all this, Seneca acknowledged, is considerable. There is a moment in Epistle 63 that does not fit neatly into the philosophical framework and was not intended to. He is writing about grief, about the correct understanding of loss, about the practices that allow a philosopher to carry bereavement without being flattened by it. And then, in a sentence whose plainness is its entire significance, he admits that he weeps when he thinks of Serenus. He weeps. The philosopher who has worked out the argument in greater detail than almost anyone in the Latin tradition, who has written to the grieving with a clarity that sometimes borders on severity, who has argued that the dead are preserved in memory in a form more stable than living presence, this philosopher weeps, and he does not apologize for it, or move quickly past it, or fold it into the argument as evidence that even the philosopher is not immune to the passions that correct thinking eventually overcomes. He sets it down and leaves it there, a single honest sentence in the middle of a letter full of considered positions. This moment is, in one reading, simply honest. Seneca knew the difference between the argument correctly understood and the argument as a lived reality. He had written it explicitly that knowing the right answer philosophically and feeling it as a genuine emotional truth are separated by considerable distance, and that the work required to cross that distance is patient, slow, and never fully finished. No single insight closes it. No correct understanding, however clearly achieved, immediately converts into equanimity. The philosophical life is not a life in which the work is done. It is a life in which the work is ongoing, where the weeping and the argument coexist, where the framework is genuinely believed and genuinely insufficient at the same moment, where the practice is continued not because it eliminates suffering, but because it gives suffering a shape that can be held rather than only endured. This is perhaps the most useful thing Seneca left behind on the question of grief. Not the framework, though the framework is careful and the distinctions in it are genuine, not the specific prescriptions. Grieve this long, not longer. Remember deliberately. Orient toward gratitude, though those are offered with more practical wisdom than they are sometimes given credit for. What he left behind, most usefully, is the model of a philosopher who knew the argument thoroughly and still wept, who made room in the same letter for the correct understanding of loss and the fact of tears, who treated the gap between knowing and feeling not as a failure of philosophical practice, but as the territory in which philosophical practice actually lives, not the end point, but the ongoing ground. The image of premeditatio as a form of sharpened attention returns when one looks at how the later letters to Lucilius actually read. They are not the letters of a man performing contentment. They are the letters of a man who has arrived, through long practice, at a particular quality of presence, the quality of someone who has stopped measuring the present against an imagined future and started attending to it on its own terms. When Seneca describes the Alexandrian grain ships arriving at Puteoli harbor, their sails sudden against the blue bay, the entire population of Puteoli moving toward the docks with the slightly festive energy of commercial spectacle, he is not describing it as backdrop. He is describing it as the actual content of a life being lived with attention. The ships are there, the sails are there, the press of people and the particular quality of light off the water are there. He is there, watching, finding in the ordinary spectacle something that does not require philosophical elevation to be worth noticing. It is enough. It is, in fact, the kind of enough that premeditatio is designed to reveal, the sufficiency of the present moment, visible only to the attention that has been trained to look for it. There is a shape to how grief changes under philosophical practice, and it is not the shape of diminishment. Something that was large does not become small. What was central does not move to the periphery and stay there, growing steadily fainter with the reassuring predictability of a problem being solved. The shape is stranger than that and more accurate to experience. What changes is the ratio between absence and presence in the way the lost person is held. In the early period of grief, absence dominates. The person is defined in memory primarily by the fact of their not being here, and every recollection arrives through that filter, arrives as evidence of loss rather than evidence of what was. Over time, under patient philosophical attention, the ratio shifts, the presence becomes more available. The person becomes, gradually, more fully themselves in memory, not the gap they left, but the person who occupied it, with their specific qualities and specific weight, permanent in the past, that holds them unchanged. This is what Seneca meant when he said, in Epistle 63, that a dead friend is preserved in a form paradoxically more stable than living presence. Living presence is contingent. It changes, argues, disappoints, arrives late, forgets what it said yesterday, is subject to fortune in all the ordinary ways that living is subject to fortune. Memory, deliberate, attentive, philosophical memory, holds what was essential. It holds the friendship in the form it had when it was most fully itself. This is not idealization, not the softening of the dead into a pleasanter version of who they were. It is more specific than that, and more honest. It holds the actual arguments, the actual silences, the actual moments of failure, alongside the actual moments of genuine connection. What it is freed from is the endless forward motion of a living relationship, the uncertainty of what comes next, the vulnerability to whatever fortune might bring. The friendship, in memory, has arrived. It is complete. It cannot be revised downward by some future disappointment. What it was, it remains, permanently, in the one form of time that Seneca argued loss cannot reach. To hold this is not to be satisfied with loss. It is not to find a philosophical position from which grief no longer has weight. The weight remains. Seneca was explicit about that, honest about it in the particular way of a man who has tested an argument against his own experience and found it partly, but only partly, adequate to what it describes. What philosophical practice offers is not the elimination of that weight, but a change in how the weight is carried, not lighter necessarily, differently distributed, less centralized in absence, more distributed across the permanent deposit of what actually was. The arms that carry it are stronger for the practice. The posture required to carry it becomes over time less effortful, not because the load has changed, but because the body carrying it has learned its shape. Seneca, in his final years, writing his letters to Lucilius, had the quality of someone who had learned that shape. The letters are not the letters of a man unburdened. He knew the Pisonian conspiracy was gathering somewhere in the city's lower weather. He knew that his position under Nero had been deteriorating for years, that the forced retirement he had taken offered protection only up to the point where Nero's court decided protection was inconvenient. His health, the chronic respiratory trouble that had followed him since his youth, had not improved with age. He had lost people. He would lose more. The situation, taken in its full extent, was not comfortable, and yet the letters from this period have a quality that is difficult to name, but unmistakable once it has been felt, a quality of genuine aliveness, of philosophical attention that has not contracted in response to circumstances, but has remained wide open, interested, continuing to find in the texture of ordinary days the material that philosophy is made from. This is what gratitude looks like when it is not a practiced emotion, but a practiced orientation. Not the grateful feeling that arrives when something wanted has been given, though that feeling is also real and also has its place. The gratitude that Stoic practice cultivates is older and quieter. It is the orientation of someone who has understood, at a level below argument, that having been here at all, having had the specific conversations and the specific friendships and the specific mornings of clear winter light, is not the baseline against which everything must be measured, but is itself the gift, not the platform for a life. The life, the practice of deliberate recollection that Seneca described in Epistle 63, is at its most developed an extension of this orientation into the territory of loss. To call to mind what a dead friend said, not in the passive, involuntary way that grief sometimes operates, but deliberately, with the specific aim of finding in the recollection something steady and warm, is to bring the past out of its sealed permanence and into contact with the present. The friend is not here. The conversation cannot continue forward, but the conversation that already happened remains entirely available. Available not as a wound, but as a deposit, permanent and complete, the specific content of a relationship that was real and is now held in the one form that loss cannot revise. What changes across time when the practice is sustained and honest is the quality of that contact. In the early period of grief, contact with memory is primarily painful. The recollection arrives as evidence of absence, as the thing that is no longer available. Later, when the orientation has shifted, the same recollection becomes more fully what it actually is, not evidence of absence, but evidence of presence, of something that happened and is therefore permanently true. The friend laughed in a particular way. The conversation took a particular turn. There was an afternoon in which something was understood between two people that has not been forgotten and cannot be taken. These things happened. They are sealed in the past that Seneca described in De Brevitate Vitae as the most secure of all our possessions, the only form of what we have that fortune cannot reach and death cannot revise. The philosophical transformation of grief, then, is not a project with a completion date. It is not a process that ends when the grief ends, because grief of this kind does not end in the ordinary sense. What it has when philosophical practice is sustained across it is a kind of maturation, the movement from acute to settled, from absent-centered to present-centered, from wound to ground. The wound does not disappear, but over time and through the patient disciplines of attention and deliberate recollection and the honest examination of what grief is actually about, the ground beneath it becomes more available. The philosopher stands, gradually, not only in the loss but in everything that the loss was the loss of, in the actual richness of the relationship, in the specific weight of what was real, in the permanent deposit of what has already been given and cannot now be taken back. Seneca admitted, without softening the admission, that none of this is straightforward. The distance between knowing the argument clearly and feeling it as a lived emotional truth is not crossed once and then crossed. It is crossed and recrossed, patiently over a long time, and there are mornings. He knew this, wrote around it carefully in the letters to Lucilius, when the weight sits at the front of the room again, and the argument has to be found and held again, not as a conclusion already reached, but as a practice being begun once more. The philosopher who has worked through grief most carefully is not the philosopher who no longer weeps. They are the philosopher who weeps, and then, after a time, picks up the practice again, who finds in the picking up itself something that is neither triumph nor denial, but the steady continuation of the examined life, which does not resolve all suffering, but gives suffering a form that a human being can carry without being broken by it. There is something in the act of writing itself, in Seneca's final years, that enacts this in a form beyond argument. The letters to Lucilius were not dashed off. They were composed with care, each one complete in itself, each one finding in some ordinary starting point, a harbor, a crowd, a reading, a walk, the material for a philosophical observation that was neither forced nor performed. He was working in those letters at the intersection of practice and expression, demonstrating in the act of composition the quality of presence that philosophy, at its most developed, is supposed to produce. The grief was in them, the knowledge of what was coming was in them, the failing body, the political precariousness, the accumulated losses of a long life lived in difficult proximity to power. All of it was in them, not as the subject, but as the ground beneath every subject. And the letters continued, the philosophical attention continued, the careful notation of what was observed and what was thought and what was found to be worth passing on. This continued in the specific voice of a man who had learned that continuation is itself the practice. What has already been lived well is the only thing that cannot be lost. This is what Seneca wrote in De Brevitate Vitae, and it is what he enacted across a long life of grief and illness and exile in the constant proximity of political danger, in the simple act of continuing to think carefully about how to live. The past of that thinking is permanent. Every letter sent, every argument made with genuine honesty, every moment in which the examined life was lived with real attention rather than only discussed, these are sealed. They cannot be revised by what comes next. They are, in the only sense that the philosophy requires, complete. The scroll on the afternoon table, partially unrolled, the passage about Serenus still open. The grief that has moved from the foreground to somewhere behind the wall, closer now to the permanent deposit than to the wound. The afternoon light continuing through the window, steady and unhurried, across the words already written and already true, belonging entirely to the past that holds them without change, the quiet fullness of what has already been. Crantor of Soli sat in a room in Athens in the early 3rd century before the Common Era, and the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms are quiet when a person has been alone in them for a long time. The writing surface before him was smooth, and the morning light came through at a low angle, flattening everything it touched the same pale color. He was working on something that had not been done before, not exactly, not in this form, which was the attempt to address grief in writing, directly, as a philosopher speaks to a person in pain, rather than as a logician addresses a problem awaiting solution. The text he was beginning would not survive. Later philosophers would quote from it, summarize it, argue with it, and the quotations and summaries are all that remain, a text that still casts a shadow, even though the object that made the shadow is gone. What he wrote, in those quiet morning hours in Athens, was the first known philosophical consolation in the Western tradition, and the question it attempted to answer was the same question every person lying awake in the dark has ever carried. What is to be done with grief, and is philosophy of any use to it at all? Crantor did not begin by telling his reader that grief was an error. That position would come later, developed with systematic thoroughness by the Stoic schools, refined through generations of argument into a precise philosophical claim about the structure of false belief. Crantor began somewhere less demanding and more honest, which was with the observation that grief is natural, but to feel loss, to feel it with weight and with duration, is not a sign of philosophical failure, but something closer to a sign of good character. The word he reached for was metriopathia, the moderation of passion rather than its elimination, and the position it named was that measured grief is appropriate, human, and even expressive of the kind of moral seriousness that takes its relationships seriously. To grieve too little, on this account, is as troubling as to grieve too much. The question is not whether to feel the loss, but whether the feeling moves through its natural arc, or whether it lodges and becomes something else, something that no longer serves the dead or the living, something that has mistaken its own persistence for loyalty. The text Crantor wrote, Peripenthos on grief, was widely read for centuries after his death, copied and carried and argued over in the way that useful things are. Cicero read it in the 1st century BCE and found it the best of the consolatory text available to him, which was high praise from a man who had read nearly everything and was in no mood to accept comfort he did not believe. The tradition Crantor began was not a tradition of answers. It was a tradition of sitting with the question carefully enough that even the sitting itself becomes a form of philosophical work, the page as companion, the argument as company, in a room that would otherwise hold only silence, and the particular weight of what is absent. In Athens, in the century after Crantor, the Stoic schools were developing a position that differed from his metriopatheia in a way that would shape philosophical consolation for centuries. Where Crantor had argued for the moderation of grief, the Stoics argued for something more radical, the examination of the belief that generates grief in the first place, the claim that if the belief can be seen clearly enough, the grief built on it begins to lose its ground. The grief itself was not the problem. The judgment beneath the grief was the problem. And the judgment that a genuine evil has occurred, that something of fundamental value has been taken, could, with patience and with honest philosophical work, be examined until it disclosed what it was actually made of. This was not the same as saying grief is wrong. It was saying grief points towards something worth looking at carefully, what it means to value another person, what it means to believe that another person can be lost. The Stoic consolation tradition that grew from these arguments was demanding in a way that Crantor's had not been. It asked the bereaved person to do something genuinely difficult, which was to hold their grief still long enough to look at it philosophically, to ask what judgment it rested on and whether that judgment was sound. The Stoics understood that this was not a brief undertaking. They were not saying that grief should end quickly, or that a philosopher who grieves for a long time has failed. They were saying that grief, rightly attended to, can become the occasion for a kind of seeing that would not otherwise be available. The kind of seeing that comes when a loss has stripped away ordinary assumptions and left the question of what actually matters standing in the open air without its usual coverings. Running alongside the Stoic tradition and never fully reconciled with it was the position associated with Aristotle's school, the position that feeling is not something philosophy should aim to eliminate, but something it should aim to properly order. Aristotle's word for this was also metriopatheia, used in a slightly different key than Crantor's, but pointing in the same direction. The idea that the person of good character feels grief in the right degree, at the right time, for the right duration, in proportion to the actual loss sustained. Not too much, not too little, but measured by reality and by love. This position felt closer to ordinary moral experience than the Stoic one. Most people, when they considered the matter honestly, did not want to eliminate grief. They wanted to grieve appropriately, to honor what had actually been lost without being consumed by the loss. The Aristotelian tradition gave philosophical sanction to that ordinary intuition, and because it did, it persisted alongside the Stoic account as its permanent counterweight, each position clarifying the other by contrast. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, in the same broad period when the Stoic schools were consolidating their arguments, Epicurus was developing a very different philosophical resource for those confronting loss. The Epicurean approach to grief did not focus primarily on correcting false judgments about value. It focused on removing fear of death, and it did this through one of the most precise arguments in ancient philosophy, the argument that the dead person is no longer present to experience deprivation. Death on this account is not a state, it is an absence. The person who has died is not in darkness, not in pain, not in loss. The person who has died is simply no longer present to experience anything at all. And if this is so, then the condition of the dead is not one that warrants fear on their behalf, because there is no longer a subject there for whom anything could be bad. Where the Stoic consolation worked on the judgment of the bereaved person, on what the grief was claiming about value, the Epicurean consolation worked on the content of the fear, on what death was actually being imagined as. Two different philosophers, looking at the same suffering and reaching for different tools because they had diagnosed the suffering differently. The texts in which these arguments appear are for the most part not texts of crisis. They are texts of a tradition that had been thinking about grief for generations, adding arguments, refining positions, discovering what the previous formulation had missed. Each philosopher wrote in the knowledge that others had written before them, and in the knowledge that what they were adding to the conversation would be argued with, revised, and used in ways they could not fully predict. This is what a tradition looks like from the inside, not a line of progressive discovery, not a series of corrections moving toward a final answer, but a long conversation in which the same question is asked in different voices, and the asking itself is part of what the tradition does for those who need it. Crantor's text was lost. Aristotle's consolatory writings, if he wrote them, are gone. What survives is partial and uneven, the residue of a much larger conversation rather than the conversation itself. And yet, even in the residue, the thing the tradition was trying to do is visible. It was trying to give grief a form, to offer the person in pain not a prescription for how long grief should last or how it should feel, but a set of questions that grief could be held inside of, examined from, placed in relation to a larger understanding of what time and love and loss actually are. The philosophical consolation was never a cure. The best writers in the tradition knew this and said so. What it was, at its most honest, was company, another mind that had thought carefully about the same difficulty, offering what it had found, knowing that what it had found might not be equal to what was needed, and saying so anyway. Quais a Pharaoh came to the consolation tradition in 45 BCE from a direction none of the earlier writers had taken, which was the direction of his own grief. His daughter Tullia had died in childbirth in February of that year, and Cicero, who had read every philosophical text on grief available to him and had written with authority about Stoic and academic and Epicurean positions, found himself confronted with the strange experience of knowing the arguments and being unable to feel their force. He wrote to his friend Atticus in the weeks after Tullia's death with an honesty that is still startling after 2,000 years, saying that the books offered no relief, that he had read Crantor and found it the best of the consolatory texts and still could not use it, that the usual sources of consolation were closed to him, and that he did not know what to do. The man who was Rome's greatest orator, the man who could shape an argument into any form and bring an audience to any emotion he chose, was sitting in his villa at Astura, unable to produce the thing he had always been able to produce, which was words that worked. What Cicero did in that condition was what the tradition would later call the self-directed consolation. He wrote a consolatio addressed to himself, a text in which all the resources of the philosophical tradition were turned toward his own grief, in which he was both the writer and the intended reader, both the philosopher and the bereaved person the philosopher was trying to reach. The text is lost, as Crantor's is lost, but the letters to Atticus survive around it, and in them the shape of his attempt is visible. He knew the arguments, he could reproduce them accurately, he could probably have written a consolation for another person's grief at that moment, and done it well. What he could not do was feel the arguments as relief, rather than as philosophy, feel them with the part of himself that had been Tullia's father, rather than the part that had spent a lifetime reading. He acknowledged this without embarrassment, in letters that were not written for publication, in the plain voice of a man who had found the limit that no genre fully crosses, and by acknowledging it, he added something to the tradition that the tradition needed, the honest testimony that knowing the right answer, philosophically, and feeling it as a lived reality are two different things, separated by a distance that patience alone can close, and that impatience only widens. In the first century of the Common Era, writing from Rome and from Corsican exile, and from the complicated position of a philosopher employed at the court of an emperor he could not entirely trust, Seneca joined this tradition as a correspondent rather than as a systematic theorist. Where Crantor had written a treatise, Seneca wrote letters. Where Cicero had written a consiliio, addressed to himself in the third person, Seneca addressed his consolations to specific people: Marcia, Lucilius, Marullus, Polybius, people whose names he knew and whose grief he had some knowledge of, at least from a distance. The letter as a form suited what Seneca was trying to do. Because a letter is by nature particular, it arrives in a specific situation, addresses a specific person, acknowledges that the argument must find its way into a life already in progress, rather than a life waiting to begin. The consolation letter knew it was arriving late, that the grief had been there before the letter and would be there after it, and that its task was not to end the grief, but to offer it something useful, a way of thinking about it that the griefer might not have found alone. A question worth staying with. A piece of company that said, "Someone has thought carefully about this, and here is what they found." The position Seneca held in this tradition was not the one Crantor had established. Seneca was a Stoic, and the Stoic account of grief was more demanding than Crantor's metriopatheia. It asked for more than the moderation of passion. It asked for the examination of the judgment that generates passion, the honest inquiry into whether what grief claims about the nature of loss is actually true. Seneca held this position clearly and defended it in some of his most difficult letters, including his letter to Marullus on the death of a young son, where the unsparing quality of the argument is deliberately maintained rather than softened, where the hardness of the philosophical claim is presented not as coldness but as respect, the argument that a true friend does not offer comfortable agreement, but the most honest account available, on the grounds that agreement with a false belief, however kind it feels, extends the suffering rather than addressing it. This was a demanding position to take towards someone in acute grief, and Seneca knew it was demanding. He argued for it anyway. And yet Seneca's place in the tradition was not simply as the most rigorous Stoic in the room. There was something else in his consolatory writing that the systematic position alone does not account for, a willingness to acknowledge, in his own voice, that the framework and the experience of grief do not always meet cleanly. In Epistle 63 he wrote about Serenus, his dead friend, and in the middle of the arguments about grief and memory and the philosophical practice of recollection, there is a sentence in which Seneca says he weeps when he thinks of him, not performed grief, not a philosophical example. The philosopher setting down the argument for a sentence to make room for the fact, and then picking it back up. This was not a contradiction of the Stoic position. It was the Stoic position held by a human being, which means held imperfectly, with the acknowledged imperfection itself part of the testimony, evidence that the tradition knew what it was asking for and did not pretend it was easy. Across the sea and across the century, in the Boeotian town of Chaeronea, Plutarch was writing from a very different philosophical tradition. He was a Platonist, and the resource his tradition offered to those facing grief was one the Stoics did not have and could not use, which was the possibility that the person who had died continues to exist. Plutarch believed in the soul's immortality, and when his daughter Timoxena died in childhood, the consolation letter he wrote to his wife was shaped by that belief at every point. The tenderness in it is unmistakable even after 2,000 years. The argument it makes is that the soul of a child who dies young returns to a purer condition, freed from the entanglement of bodily life before those entanglements have deepened, and that this return is not a loss for the soul, even if it is a loss for those who loved it. This was not an argument available to Seneca. The Stoic soul disperses back into the rational substance of the cosmos. It does not persist as an individual consciousness that can be met again. Plutarch's consolation offered his wife something the Stoic consolation could not offer, and what it offered was shaped entirely by the philosophical framework that made the argument possible. Placed side by side, these two consolations, Seneca's to Marcia, Plutarch's to Timoxena, illuminate how profoundly the philosophical framework within which a consolation is written determines the form of relief it can provide. They are both serious philosophical documents. They are both written with evident care for the person addressed. They reach for entirely different resources because they inhabit different understandings of what death is, what the dead are, and what the living can honestly be told. Crantor's Metriopathia sits between them as a reminder that the question of what grief requires is not the same question as the question of what death means, that even philosophers who disagree about the soul's fate can find common ground in the observation that measured grief honors both the dead and the living in a way that unmeasured grief does not. The tradition did not converge. It widened. Each new voice added something and left something else unresolved, and the unresolved parts were not failures of thought, but the honest edges of questions that remained genuinely open. The Consolation as a form carried within it, from its earliest pages, the acknowledgement that philosophy has limits. Cicero named this limit in his letters to Atticus, and could not cross it. Seneca named it in Epistle 63, and sat with it for a sentence before returning to the argument. Even the Stoic tradition's most uncompromising position, that grief rests on a correctable error of judgment, contained within it the implicit acknowledgement that correcting the judgment takes time, that the correction is psychological work as much as philosophical work, that the person who knows the right answer has not yet done what is required to feel it as relief. The tradition was honest about this. At its best, it did not offer consolation as a thing that would work immediately, or work completely, or work without the griever's active engagement with the questions being raised. It offered consolation as an invitation into a certain kind of thinking that had been found by those who did it seriously enough and long enough to eventually produce something that felt less like pain and more like understanding. In the cities of the Roman world, in Rome, in Alexandria, in Carthage, in the smaller towns of Asia Minor, where Stoic teachers had established schools, the consolatory letter circulated as a form of philosophical practice that most educated people would encounter at least once in their lives, either as reader or as recipient. Grief was not a private affair in the ancient world in the way it often is now. It was a social occasion, a religious occasion, and for those in philosophical circles, a philosophical occasion, a moment when the questions that philosophy had been preparing people to answer actually arrived in someone's household and required a response. The consolation was one of the ways that response was formalized, the offer through the concentrated medium of a letter or a treatise of what the tradition had found to be true about loss, offered with the understanding that the recipient would bring their own philosophical formation to bear on it and take from it what they could use. What the tradition found to be true about loss varied by school and by century and by individual writer, but certain things recurred across the differences. The observation that grief unattended can harden into a permanent condition that serves neither the dead nor the living. The observation that deliberate recollection of the dead, calling to mind what they said, what they valued, what they characteristically did, is a form of philosophical practice that transforms the absence into something more manageable than simple loss. The observation that time, which feels in early grief like an enemy, eventually discloses itself as the medium through which grief finds its natural arc, if the griever is willing to follow rather than resist. These were not uniquely Stoic observations. They appear in Crantor, in Cicero, in Plutarch, in Seneca, in different registers, and with different philosophical justifications, because they were observations that honest attention to grief tended to produce regardless of what school one came from. The tradition was not merely arguing about grief. In its best moments, it was learning from it. There is a passage in Plutarch's Consolation to his wife that describes their daughter as she was in life, her particular quality of delight, her small face, the specific way she expressed joy that was unlike any other child's expression of joy, and the passage exists to establish that the girl who died was genuinely that specific person, that the loss is real and particular, and not merely the loss of an instance of childhood in general. This is something the philosophical tradition had to keep learning, that grief is always for someone specific, not for loss in the abstract, and that any consolation that does not acknowledge the specific person risks offering relief to the wrong grief. Seneca understood this. The letters he wrote to Marcia, to Lucilius, to Marulus are all addressed to people whose specific loss he names and acknowledges before the argument begins. The argument arrives second. The acknowledgement of the particular person, the particular love, the particular absence, this arrives first, because without it the argument has no place to stand. The later Stoics wrote about grief in the knowledge that the tradition had been at this for centuries and had not resolved the fundamental question. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the privacy of what would eventually become the Meditations, returned to the same cluster of ideas repeatedly: dissolution, impermanence, the rational substance of the cosmos, receiving back what it had briefly lent, the brevity of any individual life measured against the span of time that preceded and follows it. He was not discovering these arguments. He had read Seneca, read Epictetus, read further back into the tradition. What he was doing in his private notebook on the Danube frontier was testing whether the arguments held, when the testing was real, when the grief was for actual people he had known and lost, when the impermanence was not a philosophical position, but a daily fact of his life as emperor. He kept returning to the arguments. He kept writing them out again in slightly different words. The repetition itself is evidence of how the tradition actually worked, not as a set of conclusions that once grasped did their work automatically, but as a set of practices that required daily renewal, positions that had to be inhabited again and again to remain inhabited. The grief that philosophy most honestly addresses is not the acute phase, the days and weeks immediately after a loss, when the pain has the quality of a physical condition, when it takes the form of a specific absence in every room and at every meal. The tradition's consolations mostly arrive slightly after that, when the griever is capable of reading, capable of following an argument, capable of the kind of sustained attention that a philosophical text requires. Crantor's text arrived in that window. Seneca's letters arrived in it. Plutarch's letter to his wife arrived in it. They were not emergency intervention. They were philosophical company for the longer walk, the months and years during which grief gradually changes form, losing some of its acuteness without losing its reality, becoming something that can be thought about rather than something that only happens to the griever. The ancient writers who worked in this tradition were people who had experienced loss themselves, and they wrote from inside that experience rather than from above it. Crantor had lost people, Cicero had lost Tullia, Plutarch had lost his daughter, Seneca had lost Serenus, and other members of his philosophical circle had lived under the perpetual possibility of political death, had spent years in the strange social and physical exile of Corsica. The authority of the tradition rested not only on the quality of its arguments, but on the fact that the arguments had been tested against real grief, had been found wanting in some respects and adequate in others, and had been revised accordingly. When Cicero wrote to Atticus that Crantor's text was the best available and still did not help him, he was not dismissing the tradition. He was adding his honest testimony to it, testimony that the tradition needed in order to remain honest about what it could and could not do. Every voice in the tradition was doing this in some way, adding what they had found, acknowledging what they had not been able to find, leaving the question open in the places where it was genuinely open. The consolatio tradition passed from the ancient world into the medieval and the modern in fragments and transformations, the philosophical arguments absorbed into religious frameworks, adapted, disputed, set aside, and rediscovered. Seneca's letters were copied by monks who found in them a moral seriousness that resonated with their own disciplines, even where the theology differed entirely. Cicero's Tusculan disputations, which drew on the consolation tradition systematically, shaped how educated Europeans thought about grief and fortitude for over 1,000 years. The arguments changed form as they moved, but the central undertaking, the attempt to offer philosophical company to those carrying grief, persisted through the changes. The tradition was not trying to solve grief, and the best of its writers knew this. It was trying to give grief the kind of thoughtful attention that prevents it from becoming a permanent condition, that gently and repeatedly reminds the griever that they are not alone in the difficulty, that people have thought carefully about this and found paths through it, that the loss is real and the walk is long, and there is something to carry that is useful. In the quiet of what was probably his study in Rome, in the years before his forced suicide, Seneca was still writing letters to Lucilius. The lamp was burning, the scroll was open. Outside, the city was making its ordinary nighttime sounds, the sound of a city that would continue after him, that had continued through the loss of everyone who had ever lived in it. He was a man who had thought about grief for most of his adult life, had written about it in several registers, and for several audiences, had found in the practice of philosophy not a cure for loss, but a way of living alongside it that preserved the thing philosophy most wanted to preserve, the capacity to keep thinking, to keep examining, to remain in honest engagement with the questions, rather than retreating into the forms of comfort that require no examination and offer no real return.